Up next, how you can waste half a day and make your car go even worse because you don't understand heat transfer. Yes! I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, the place where Aussie new car buyers save thousands off their next new cars. Hit me up on the website for that. Note to self. I really should not watch car videos recreationally over the holidays. See, on Christmas Day, I was about to enter the self-induced hyperglycemic food coma, as you do in the first world, respectfully to celebrate the fake virgin birth of the fake son of the fake Christian Kim Jong-un in the sky. So dignified, so typical. And late in play on that day, incipient coma, I am watching an old episode of MightyCarMods for kicks because I really like their channel. They're funny, engaging, enthusiastic automotive dudes. And Moog, whose real name is Blair, who's half of the show, proved himself to be a very, very brave man once to me because he agreed to be interviewed by me when I was a host on Talk Radio in Sydney, which is a very scary proposition. And he was great. So I'm a fan of Marty and Moog and MightyCarMods, and they're hugely successful. So, respect. And then, imagine my surprise as I find myself pleasantly shouting my vehement disagreement into the face of my computer at the conclusion to their report called Black Intercoolers Myth Busted. There's a link in the description. It's had 1.3 million views in the past 3.5 years, that review, and it's just wrong, but right at the end, it's so wrong. To me, this whole end of the report revelation is kind of like Julia Roberts revealing that she's in fact a ladyboy at the conclusion of Pretty Woman. And not to disrespect the T component of the LGBT community, but you would have to admit that this would change the entire tone of the movie. At least it would have for me. Anyway, together with a mechatronics engineer whose parents must have hated him, named Mouseworks, Marty and Moog ran a brilliant experiment and then they botched a conclusion quite badly. In my view, we are very fortunate that the 4 laws of thermodynamics did not go on strike by way of indignant protest, causing the universe itself to shut down, which would be bad. MightyCarMods decided that painting your intercooler black makes a massive difference to its thermal performance, and therefore it makes your hot car even hotter by making the inlet air cooler. And at that point, my engineering spider sense wrote an outraged letter to my management team requesting an urgent jihad on bullshit. And here we are. I love me a good jihad on bullshit, but I don't want to disrespect Marty and Moog. And in any case, they got nearly all of that report right, except, of course, the conclusion. But it does worry me that thousands of fine upstanding car modifiers have subsequently wasted a perfectly serviceable Saturday afternoon or something, painting their intercoolers black and ultimately making their turbocharged cars go slightly worse, which I'm sure was not the intent. So, the better for you to understand the Tao of heat transfer, let us go live now to Shitsville. We can probably all agree that the function of an intercooler is to manage the temperature of the air on its way into the engine. And there's really only 3 items on the menu if you want to manage heat flow. You can do it by conduction, by radiation, or by convection. And conduction is pretty simple to understand. It's like in the blacksmith shop, it mainly pertains to the flow of heat through solids. So in the blacksmith shop, you get a piece of steel, you put it in the hot coals, you crank up the blower, and one end of that piece of steel can easily emerge cherry red, the better for beating into shape. But as the blacksmith's apprentice, you'd learn pretty quickly, I think, to pick up even the black end of that piece of steel with a nice robust pair of tongs, otherwise nasty burns. Not that relevant to an intercooler though, I'd suggest, all of this conduction business. Radiation is the next one on the menu. It's kind of like the sun. And you'll note that on a hot sunny day here in Australia, you could go out into a field in the middle of the day and you'd feel pretty hot pretty quickly because of the sun. Now the sun is a massive nuclear fusion furnace. and it is 500 light seconds away. So thermal energy leaves the sun and it rockets through the vacuum of space at almost absolute zero around it for 500 seconds, and then it emerges and impacts into you and you feel hot regardless. So radiation doesn't require any medium in order to be transmitted, even huge distances. But the funny thing about radiation is that you can stand in the middle of that paddock and feel really hot, and then you can walk just a few meters and go and stand under a tree, and all of a sudden you will feel instantly cooler, even though the temperature of the air is the same in the sun as it is under the tree. And this is because, of course, the leaves are doing a fantastic job photosynthesizing the crap out of all of that sunlight energy that's hitting the leaves. And as a result, they're not hitting you, so you're feeling a whole bunch cooler. That's like radiation. Same thing when you sit in front of a campfire at night. The thing that warms you up is the radiant heat coming from the fire and hitting you. And finally, you've got convection, which I'd suggest is the main mechanism at play inside a thing like an intercooler. And convection really pertains to the heat transfer from a solid and into a fluid. And a fluid's got a special meaning in physics. It really means a liquid or a gas. In the case of an intercooler, heat is being transferred from the metal outer skin of the intercooler and into the surrounding air. So that would be like convection. Another good example of convection would be all those animals that survive in cold places, like the wolves in the Arctic Circle or something. They've got all this thick fur, and it's really got nothing to do with radiation and nothing to do with conduction either, and everything to do with managing convective heat loss. In fact, convective heat loss is what kills you if you are unlucky enough to die of exposure. It's like wind chill factor. You know, you're in the Arctic Circle or something, or Siberia, and all of a sudden, you know, you're standing inadequately clothed in a field. And it feels pretty cold if it's minus 10 degrees, because then normal convection is working on you. It's going to feel a whole lot colder if the wind picks up though, because then you'll be the subject of a forced convection heat loss experiment that can easily kill you. And that's what wind chill factor is. It's just an example that forced convection, where the fluid is flowing over the thing that's losing the heat, is a whole lot more effective than just normal convection where there's no sort of forced fluid flow. So those are the three mechanisms for heat loss. You've got your conduction, you've got your radiation, you've got your convection, and I'd suggest that the dudes from MightyCarMods should have paid a whole lot more attention to which modes are actually operating during their experiment. The MightyCarMods dudes ran a brilliant experiment. They plumbed a hairdryer up the bum of the intercooler and they cranked it up. When the temperatures finally stabilised, they measured the difference in temperature between the air going up the bum and then the air coming out the mouth of the intercooler on the engine inlet air side. And they came away thus with 4 critical temperature measurements. 2 with the intercooler unpainted as bare aluminium, or aluminum if you're American, and then 2 with it painted with 1 coat of etch primer and 1 coat of matte black over the top, allegedly to boost its emissivity and make it better at doing its job. They did 2 different black versus bare tests, one with no airflow through the intercooler and the other with airflow from an electric radiator fan plugged into a car battery. So this experiment was very well set up. They found that when there was no airflow through the intercooler, like when you are idling at the lights, the silver intercooler in their experiment had a temperature differential of 38 degrees C between up the bum and out the mouth. When it was black, with no airflow, the temperature differential climbed to 77 degrees. Yes, win for black. With the fan on though, the silver intercooler rocked in with a temperature differential of 100 degrees, and the painted one, all black, nicely emitting, posted 97. That's bad. And it must be said that there was a great deal of urinating in the trousers in that report over the no flow result, 38 degrees climbing up to 77, while the 97 versus 100 degree result was, for the fan on test, that was dismissed as insignificant. This was the point, I think, where every engineer or scientist who ever watched that video had to projectile vomit into a bucket. I know I did, because that 97 versus 100 result was basically game over for the case for painting your intercooler black. Oh well. Meanwhile, back in Shitsville... Is there nothing you can't do with a pair of bolt cutters, particularly those 3-foot long ones? The keys to everything. And did you cop the look on New South Wales' finest's face on the way through? As if it's not totally normal on a holiday weekend to be up to your waist in the engine bay of a car at the roadside with a pair of 36-inch bolt cutters. Anyway, here is a factory intercooler. You get hot air coming out of the turbo on its way into the engine, goes in this end. It flows through this core along these horizontal tubes that are all the way through this thing, and then it comes out here on the way to the engine. This is the inlet air part just here, and obviously the core has a whole bunch of those fins, just like a radiator, only an intercooler is a radiator for air. I can just see through there. They're pretty dense though. Anyway, that's the cooling mechanism, and obviously you want to cool air down on the way into your engine because it increases the density. That means more mass of air during every combustion cycle in the cylinder, and that means you can burn more fuel. Ultimately, the better to extract more useful work out of every combustion event, which is why turbochargers literally pump up the performance of these smaller displacement engines. So I can tell that this device is all about convection. And what you really want from a heat exchanger is you want the greatest temperature differential number between the hot air coming in and the cooler air coming out. So if you're going to run an experiment like the MightyCarMods one, the bigger the differential, the better. And the biggest differential they got was 100 degrees. That was the bare intercooler with airflow through it, 100 degrees. If you paint it 97, that's kind of a bit retarded when you think about it. All right, so I can tell that an intercooler is all about convection for a couple of different reasons. And the first one is I don't even need the intercooler to do this. I just basically need the car, and I need to know where the intercooler is. And when I look at it, the intercooler is mounted just there in the car, in that big fat hole in the pointy end. The better to expose it to ambient airflow. And in fact, every major heat exchange device in the car, the radiator for the engine coolant and also the air conditioning condenser, they're up the pointy end as well because they're all convective coolers. And when I look at this, I can tell straight away that it's all about convection because it's all about airflow through here. And there is conduction going on as well. Obviously, the whole thing's made of aluminium. Aluminium's a really good thermally conductive metal, and it's also easy to manufacture, and it's relatively cheap compared with, say, copper, which has got a slight edge on thermal conductivity but costs heaps more. So anyway, it's all about convection because in between these tubes that are carrying the engine inlet air, there's all of these fins, and all they do is they act just like a heat exchanger in a piece of electronics. You know those big aluminium blocks with the fins that they put on top of hot electronic chips? Well, this is exactly the same thing, and it's just capitalizing on the thermal conductivity of aluminium to expose it to as much air as possible. And then, you know, when you see air flowing through anything to cool it down, that is the biggest engineering red flag you will ever see, that this is about convection. The other thing I obviously know about this is it's not painted, and painting is completely irrelevant for convection. You'd paint something black if it was really a radiator. If it was radiating, it would be black. That would increase its emissivity. But I think you'll find in the 70s the only reason they painted radiators and other devices like that black was to prevent corrosion, because it just wasn't practical to build them out of aluminium at that time. I know I do spend a disproportionate amount of my life kicking car makers in the wetting vegetables for making fundamental mistakes. But the fact is, modern intercoolers and radiators are left unpainted for a reason, because it maximises their convective heat transfer performance. Or, if you neglected to study, you get maximum inlet air voodoo with your intercooler nude. If car makers could make modern radiators and intercoolers more efficient by painting them black, they just would. They would. Engine design is largely based on intensive thermodynamic analysis and decision making, and some of the best brains in the business are on the case. It's obvious, you don't get to work as an engineer in an R&D facility without being a proper brainiac, propeller-headed cap and everything. These are places that practice computational flow dynamics like an extreme sport, modelling the flow pathways of differential elements of air inside the engine bay. These people are all engineering Yodas, so it is inconceivable that just such a brainiac watching the MightyCarMods video saw a light bulb illuminate mid-air and thought, why didn't we think of that? Black, yes. For perspective on this, I spoke to a senior executive at Hyundai about the number of 1.6 turbo engines out there in service globally, and his guesstimate was about 300,000. So let's run with that. I'd suggest that if you're going to make 300,000 of anything, intercoolers, whatever, rubber, dog shit, it doesn't matter, it's incumbent upon you to optimise the crap out of the design. And that intercooler cletus removed so breathtakingly from the i30 in the manner of an ex-wife with a rusty spoon is one of 300,000 units deployed out there in the world. It weighs about 4 kilos. So that's 120 tonnes of aluminium for all of them out there. If black paint worked, you'd save tons of raw material, plus the intercooler could be made physically smaller, which would help with the packaging in the engine bay. If black helped, they'd be black, ex-factory. Unfortunately, it doesn't, which is why they're not. So the differential diagnosis here for should you paint your intercooler black is it's not black ex-factory, and making it black would be an easy, cheap win for the manufacturer if painting it black worked. Therefore, it doesn't. I guess the other burning question is there a case for making your intercooler more efficient when the car is stopped with the engine running, like you stopped at the lights or something? Because the MightyCarMods experiment really did show that if you paint your intercooler black, it's going to reject heat better in that situation because it's a better emitter of radiation. But I'd suggest that there's no case for doing that in the real world, because when your car is stopped at the lights, the turbo is not boosting. There's no need for the intercooler to do its mad density improving voodoo, and your engine will not benefit as a consequence, particularly if you modify it to do that and that hurts its performance higher up in the rev range when the car is actually moving forward and you need performance to, I don't know, overtake a truck or something. I guess the other thing to consider is that the MightyCarMods experiment really did not cover off what would happen inside an engine bay if you paint your intercooler black, because on the bench, it certainly did a good job rejecting heat into the environment around it. But the unfortunate thing about making something a better emitter is you also make it a better absorber of radiant heat energy. And there's plenty of radiant sources of heat inside the car itself. If you've got one of those pancake intercoolers sitting on top of the engine, you will have heat from the turbo, heat from the exhaust manifold, and heat from the engine block itself working its way into the intercooler. And if it's hanging out the front here, as it is on the i30, it's subject to bleeding heat from the radiator, as well as other sources of heat, maybe even sunlight if the angle's particularly dodgy, and heat coming off the road, because let's not forget that during a hot Aussie summer the road gets really hot and it's radiating upwards towards the intercooler as well. So for all these reasons, I'd suggest probably a bad idea overall to paint any intercooler black. Have you got the keys? What do you mean? I thought you had the keys. It's all right. There is no spoon. Oh. Whew. Ladies and gentlemen, Cletus Van Dam. That man is an infrared beacon, a black body, particularly below the waist. That's what I hear. You should absolutely not paint your intercooler black ever. Firstly, it is a complete waste of your valuable time. Paint does not help convection, quite the opposite. The experiment clearly showed that paint slightly hurts convection by adding an insulation layer over the entire intercooler. Being black actually does help the intercooler radiate a bit better when there's no airflow going through it. Unfortunately, that does not help your engine's performance because if the turbo is working, the car is generally moving and there's airflow through the intercooler. And in these conditions, the paint hurts the performance, and that's bad. If you're a drag racer and you want to avoid heat soaking the intercooler during the burnout and the staging phases of the race before you take off when the lights go green, you would be far better off cooling the intercooler with a fine spray of water mist. Just let the latent heat of vaporization of a small amount of water chill your intercooler out instead of painting it black, because the water spray will not hurt the performance of the intercooler at speed in the way that painting it black will. So there's a backyard modification that actually will help. Please bear in mind, I say all of this not to heap excrement on the chaps at MightyCarMods because they are awesome YouTubers, and the experiment was absolutely first rate. Only the conclusion missed the target. And learning thermodynamics is, at times, a complete brain bender. Learning thermodynamics certainly bent my brain. I had at least 12 intracranial bleeds at university, and it was quite common among engineers. I think it explains a lot. I absolutely understand that it is fun to tweak your car in the garage at home, but if your aim is to improve its performance in doing this, do not paint anything black if that widget earns its keep by enabling convective heat transfer. It simply will not help because physics. I'm John Cadogan. I hope this helps. Thanks for watching.